There is a strip of water on this planet so small you could almost miss it on a globe. But if it closes, even for 72 hours, your fuel prices double, your grocery bill explodes, and governments across the world start making phone calls they hoped they'd never have to make. 21 miles wide at its tightest point, that's the Strait of Hormuz. And for 30 years, Iran built something around it that military analysts called impossible to penetrate. A layered, interlocking system of missiles, mines, radar, and drone swarms that was specifically designed to hold the entire global economy hostage. They called it the Steel Ring. Then one night, the United States didn't negotiate with it. They didn't threaten it. They simply erased it. And the way they did it, that's the part nobody saw coming. The strait that controls everything. To understand why this matters so deeply, you first need to feel the weight of what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. Most people look at it on a map and see a thin blue line between Iran and Oman. What they should see is the jugular vein of the global economy. Every single day, roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply passes through that narrow channel. Supertankers the length of multiple football fields carrying millions of barrels of crude squeeze through those waters around the clock. The countries feeding that supply include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself. Remove the strait from the equation, and each of those nations loses its primary export route overnight. The math becomes brutal very quickly. If those tankers stop moving for even a week, oil-importing nations from Japan to Germany to the United States start drawing down emergency reserves. Refineries begin rationing. Airlines start canceling routes. Trucking companies reroute, delay, and cut back. And those costs trickle down in ways that feel invisible, until you're standing at a gas pump staring at a number that's doubled since last Tuesday. Iran understood this better than any other nation in the region. They looked at that narrow waterway not as a transit corridor, but as a pressure valve, a weapon that didn't require a shot to be fired. All they had to do was threaten to close it, credibly, and every major economy on Earth would have to listen. So they made that threat credible. They spent 30 years and an enormous fortune making it credible. And by the time they were finished, military experts around the world were genuinely unsure whether anyone could challenge it. 30 years of construction, the Steel Ring. The Steel Ring didn't appear overnight. It was built slowly, deliberately in layers, each one designed to plug a gap that the previous layer left open. Think of it as an engineer's obsession applied to military strategy. Iran didn't just want defenses. They wanted a system so redundant, so overlapping, so deeply embedded into the geography of the strait that even a superpower would blink before challenging it. It started with the eyes. Iran installed advanced radar arrays along its southern coastline, centered heavily around the port city of Bandar Abbas, which sits almost directly on the strait. These were not the kind of radar systems you'd find on a World War II destroyer. These were sophisticated multi-spectrum tracking arrays capable of picking up aircraft and surface vessels from hundreds of miles out. Every tanker that entered the Persian Gulf was logged. Every warship was tracked. Every aircraft that strayed too close was marked. The radar was the nervous system. The missiles were the fists. Iran poured billions into its ballistic and cruise missile programs, eventually fielding over 2,000 missiles of various types across its southern territories, the Sijil, the Shahab-3, the Fateh 110. These weapons weren't sitting on open launch pads where satellites could photograph them. They were buried. Some were housed in tunnels cut directly into mountain ranges along the coast. Others were stored in hardened underground bunkers with reinforced concrete roofs thick enough to laugh off conventional airstrikes. Iranian engineers had specifically studied the kind of bombs the United States typically used in strikes and built their bunkers to survive them. Then came the islands. 3 of them sit at the mouth of the strait like sentinels: Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb. Iran had claimed these islands decades ago in a move that created lasting international controversy. But whatever the political argument, the military logic was undeniable. From those positions, you can fire directly at virtually any ship attempting to pass through the strait. The Iranians didn't waste the opportunity. They installed anti-ship missile batteries. They stationed permanent detachments of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces. They dug supply tunnels beneath the surface of each island so that resupply could happen even under aerial bombardment. Those islands weren't just military outposts. They were fortresses. But perhaps the most unsettling layer of the steel ring wasn't the missiles or the islands. It was what you couldn't see at all: naval mines. Iran had quietly assembled one of the largest stockpile of sea mines anywhere in the Middle East, and the brilliance of the strategy was almost insultingly simple. A naval mine costs a few $1,000s to produce. The supertanker it destroys is worth several $100 million. The insurance claim alone from a single sinking would be enough to shut down commercial traffic through the strait for months while underwriters reassess the risk. And mines could be deployed at night from small civilian-looking fishing vessels with no warning and no radar signature. You simply couldn't tell the difference between a fisherman and a mine layer until something exploded. And then there were the drones, the newest and in many ways the most tactically clever layer of all. Iran had invested heavily in developing cheap, mass-producible unmanned aerial vehicles. The Shahed-136 became their signature weapon, small, slow, and inexpensive enough to produce in the hundreds. The concept wasn't to use them one at a time. The concept was saturation. Launch 50 of them simultaneously in a swarm, and even the most advanced naval air defense system in the world will burn through its interceptor missiles at an alarming rate. Shoot down 49 and the 50th gets through. That 50th drone, aimed at a fuel tank or a command bridge, could change the entire calculus of an engagement. Layer upon layer upon layer. Radar watching the horizon, missiles waiting underground, fortified islands commanding the water, mines hiding beneath the surface, drones ready to swarm from above. Iranian commanders were deeply proud of what they'd built. They believed, with some justification, that they had created a defense system tailored specifically to defeat the kind of conventional naval power the United States would bring to a fight. They had studied American doctrine. They knew the U.S. relied on carrier strike groups. They knew the Navy moved in formations, so they built the steel ring to stop formations. Every gun, every launcher, every minefield was oriented toward the sea, toward ships, toward the threat they fully expected to arrive on the waterline. This was not arrogance. This was logic. Careful, studied, well-funded logic. And it had one flaw so obvious in hindsight that it's almost painful. They only looked in one direction. The blind spot. That cost everything. For years, analysts, wargamers, and defense journalists debated the same theoretical question: could the United States actually break the steel ring? The consensus kept shifting, but never fully settled. Some argued it would require a prolonged naval campaign lasting months. Others suggested the cost in American lives would be politically unacceptable. A few serious military thinkers quietly concluded that a full breach was simply not possible without a ground invasion on Iranian soil, which carried its own catastrophic implications. They were all solving the wrong problem, because the United States was never planning to fight the war Iran had prepared for. American strategic planners had watched the steel ring being built for 3 decades. They had studied every layer of it, and somewhere in that analysis, someone identified the fatal assumption buried inside Iran's entire defensive philosophy. Iran had built a fortress with an extraordinary front door, steel-reinforced, triple-locked, nearly impenetrable from the front. They had poured their energy, their resources, and their confidence into that front door. What they hadn't considered was the roof. The roof was the sky, and the sky belonged to someone else. What the US had developed over the same 30 years wasn't a bigger fleet. It wasn't more missiles. It was something Iran had completely failed to account for, a networked, layered, sensor-fused battle management system that could process information, assign targets, and execute strikes faster than any human chain of command could respond. By the time an Iranian commander could identify a threat, communicate it up the chain, receive authorization to respond, and pass that order back down to the actual weapon, it was already too late. The target had already moved, or the response was already incoming. Speed wasn't just an advantage in this scenario. Speed was the entire strategy, and that strategy began with a single missile traveling at 1,500 miles per hour directly into the heart of the steel ring's nervous system, blinding the ring. The opening move wasn't dramatic in the way most people imagine war beginning. There was no declaration, no ultimatum delivered and rejected, no news anchor cutting into programming with a breaking news chyron. The operation started in silence at an altitude most people never think about, and it started with the AGM-88 HARM. The high-speed anti-radiation missile is a weapon with a specific and elegant purpose. It doesn't lock onto a target visually. It doesn't need a laser designator or a GPS coordinate. It locks onto electromagnetic emissions. In plain terms, it hunts radar by following the radar's own signal back to its source. The radar, by doing its job, by broadcasting the signal that makes it useful, becomes the exact beacon that leads the missile directly to it. There is a particular cruelty to the geometry of that. The first AGM-88 was fired at the prime research radar installation at Bandar Abbas. The radar operators, the people whose job was to see everything coming, never saw this coming. The missile followed their own signal home. Impact time from the moment of launch to the moment of destruction was measured in seconds. The multi-million-dollar tracking array, the installation that had been logging every vessel and aircraft in the Persian Gulf, was reduced to burning scrap. 11 seconds later, a second missile arrived. This one had a different target. Not the antenna array itself. That was already gone. But the hardened power vault that fed electricity to the entire facility, including its backup systems. Without power, even the fail-safes went dark. The eyes of the steel ring's central nervous system had just been surgically removed. But that was only the beginning. 40,000 feet above the Persian Gulf, an EA-18G Growler, an electronic warfare aircraft so capable that its pilots describe it as a flying computer loaded with controlled chaos, began broadcasting. What it broadcast was destruction in the electromagnetic spectrum. High-intensity, broadband digital noise, specifically designed to overwhelm every radar frequency, every radio band, every communication channel Iran was using along that coastline. Within moments, every radar screen in every Iranian military facility along the strait turned to static. Not interference, not degraded performance. Complete, total blindness. Iranian commanders grabbed their radios. Silence. They switched to backup frequencies. Silence. They tried their encrypted emergency channels. Still nothing. This is what military doctrine calls an information vacuum. The weapons still existed. The soldiers were still at their posts. The missiles were still in their bunkers. But nobody could see. Nobody could communicate. Nobody knew what was happening or where it was happening. They were standing in a fully armed room with the lights off and every door locked from the outside. And it was inside that darkness that the main event began. Soldiers from the sky high above the cloud layer, somewhere in the darkness over the Persian Gulf, the rear cargo doors of a C-17A Globemaster III swung open. The aircraft was flying without lights. No navigation beacons, no transponder signal. To radar systems, if any had been functional, it would have appeared as atmospheric noise. Inside its cargo bay, 2,000 soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division were standing in full combat load, connected by static lines, staring at a jump light that was still red. The 82nd Airborne is not a unit you call when you need to hold a position. You call them when you need to appear somewhere that wasn't supposed to be reachable. Their entire history, from Normandy to Panama to Desert Storm, is built on one simple and terrifying principle. They go where nobody thinks soldiers can arrive. They descend from altitude, bypass every road, every checkpoint, every defensive line, and land exactly where the enemy assumed they were safest. The jump light turned green, and 2,000 soldiers stepped into the night sky above the Strait of Hormuz. This was not a beach landing. The Iranian defenders weren't watching the beaches that night anyway. Their attention, to the extent they had any attention left after the Growler went to work, was directed at the waterline, at the horizon, at the sea where they'd always expected the threat to materialize. Their missile batteries faced the water. Their machine gun nests faced the water. Their reinforced bunker openings faced the water. The mines were floating in the strait. Everything was pointed outward, toward ships. Instead, soldiers fell from the sky like rain. Directly onto the fortified islands Iran had spent decades turning into military strongholds. Directly into the space between the missile launchers and the bunkers. Into the spaces that had no defenses because nobody had ever imagined needing to defend them from above. 25,000 feet above the entire theater, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye surveillance aircraft was serving as the brain of the operation. Its radar dome, that distinctive rotating disc mounted above the fuselage, was pulling in data from over 300 miles in every direction. Every Iranian vehicle that moved, every missile launcher that shifted, every troop concentration that changed position. All of it was being processed in real time and fed instantly to a network of assets. Destroyers sitting in the Gulf, air defense batteries positioned in Allied territory to the south, and the F-35C fighters circling in wide arcs above the operational area. Here's the part that makes the physics of this operation so decisive. When an Iranian commander, somewhere in the chaos and the radio silence, managed to get a launch order to a missile battery, the E-2D had already detected the launcher's targeting radar spinning up. The Hawkeye fed that data to the nearest F-35C. The F-35C was already releasing an interceptor before the Iranian missile had cleared its launch tube. The time between Iran pressing a launch button and the United States having a weapon in the air to counter it was measured in single-digit seconds, not minutes. Seconds. Iran had built its defenses to win a patient war, a siege war, a war of attrition where the cost of attacking would eventually outweigh the benefit. The United States didn't fight that war. They fought a war measured in seconds, and they brought the stopwatch. What the paratroopers found when they hit the ground, and what those islands looked like in the hour that followed, that's a story that goes beyond tactics. Because the consequences that rippled outward from those landings reached places the soldiers themselves would never see. The island that held Iran's economy. Hostage, most people have never heard of Kharg Island. That's not an accident, and it's not because it's unimportant. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, a 12-square-mile slab of rock with no beaches worth mentioning, no tourist infrastructure, nothing that would make a travel magazine give it a second glance. But through the terminals and pipelines of that single island, roughly 90% of Iran's total oil export revenue flows. Every barrel of Iranian crude oil destined for a foreign buyer moves through Kharg. It is, in the most literal economic sense, Iran's income. Remove it, and the Iranian government, already heavily dependent on oil revenue to fund everything from military salaries to social subsidies, begins to suffocate financially within weeks. When the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit hit those shores, they didn't just capture an island, they captured Iran's checkbook. The operation was assembled with the kind of precision that takes years of planning and rehearsal to execute at that speed. The first wave arrived via MV-22 Ospreys, the tilt-rotor aircraft that can take off like a helicopter and fly like a plane, launched from amphibious assault ships stationed over 100 miles offshore. The Ospreys delivered Marines directly onto the island's elevated terrain, bypassing the coastline entirely. Simultaneously, AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters worked ahead of the landing force, suppressing ground defenses, taking out anti-aircraft positions, and creating the conditions that allowed the follow-on forces to arrive intact. Then came the LCAC hovercraft, landing craft air cushion, bringing the heavy equipment. M1 Abrams main battle tanks arrived directly onto the beach at a speed that surprised defenders who expected any armored assault to require a significant port facility. Tanks on a beach moving fast, supporting infantry that was already inside the perimeter. The Iranian garrison didn't have an answer for the sequencing of it. But here's the detail that most military analyses of this operation miss, and it's the detail that actually decided the outcome on the ground. The Marines' primary targets weren't the barracks. They weren't the communications towers or the weapons depots. Their first priority was the desalination plants. Kharg Island has no natural source of fresh water. Every drop of potable water on that island is manufactured by reverse osmosis and thermal desalination facilities that convert seawater into something survivable. The moment those facilities were secured by Marine personnel, the Iranian garrison faced a choice that had nothing to do with military courage or training or tactics. They could continue fighting, knowing that within hours they would have no water, or they could surrender and live. The facilities were secured intact. Most of the garrison chose to live. The reverberations of this move hit global financial markets within hours. Oil futures spiked sharply in overnight trading. Energy ministers from Tokyo to Berlin to Paris were on emergency conference calls before sunrise. The specific fear driving those conversations was a scorched earth scenario, the possibility that Iranian commanders, before surrendering, had managed to set fire to the oil terminals or destroy the pumping infrastructure. If that had happened, the damage to global supply wouldn't have been recoverable in weeks. It would have taken years. Markets were pricing in that possibility before they knew the outcome. The reason it didn't happen was the speed. The Marines secured the terminals and the pipelines before the order to destroy them could make its way through Iran's disrupted chain of command. In the information vacuum the Growler had created, nobody on Kharg Island was receiving clear orders from anyone. By the time communications were partially restored, the island was already under new management. The economic dimension of what happened that night is something that doesn't show up in military briefings or congressional testimony, but it was the real objective. The paratroopers controlled the strait, the Marines controlled the oil. Together, those two things controlled the situation. And 200 miles inland, a third team was handling something that made the oil pale in comparison: the Isfahan extraction. While tanker captains were rerouting their vessels and oil traders were watching their screens turn red and green in wild swings, a formation of helicopters was flying very low and very fast across the Iranian desert, and nobody on the ground was supposed to know they were there. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known within special operations circles as the Night Stalkers, exists for exactly this kind of mission. Their motto is "Death waits in the dark," which sounds like something a movie studio invented, but it was earned over decades of operations in conditions that other aviation units won't fly in. They operate at night. They operate at extremely low altitude to stay beneath radar coverage. They are extraordinarily good at delivering people to places those people were never supposed to be able to reach. On this night, they were flying MH-47G Chinook helicopters modified for long-range infiltration. Heavily laden, flying at treetop level, navigating by terrain following radar and night vision across the dark Iranian plateau, heading toward Isfahan. Isfahan is Iran's third largest city and the home of one of the most significant nuclear research facilities in the country. It's where Iran conducted uranium conversion work. It's where enrichment-related activities had been documented by international inspectors before inspections were suspended. And it was where, according to intelligence assessments that had been refined over months of collection, Iran had accumulated a stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a level that sits uncomfortably close to weapons grade. The amount was reported at over 440 pounds. That quantity, further enriched, represented a legitimate path to nuclear capability. Not a distant theoretical path, an actual, near-term path, the kind of path that changes regional security calculations permanently. Delta Force operators were aboard those Chinooks, among the most specifically skilled personnel in the American military, trained for exactly this kind of sensitive site exploitation, meaning they knew how to locate, identify, package, and extract hazardous materials under field conditions, in the dark, under potential fire, with a hard timeline driven by how long those helicopters could stay on the ground before the tactical situation deteriorated. The material was located, secured in specialized shielded transport containers, designed to prevent both radiation exposure to the extraction team and any possibility of the material being tracked or detected during movement, loaded onto the Chinooks. and the helicopters were back in the air before sunrise, heading out of Iranian airspace and toward a rendezvous that took them eventually to a secured facility inside the United States. In a single night, Iran's nuclear timeline, years of work, billions of dollars of investment, enormous diplomatic and economic cost paid in the form of decades of sanctions, was effectively reset. Not through an airstrike that would have created a humanitarian catastrophe and an international political crisis. Not through years of additional sanctions negotiations. Through a direct extraction that removed the physical material itself from the equation. The message that sent to every other nation on Earth watching events unfold was one that diplomats would spend years unpacking. The United States had demonstrated that it could reach into a heavily defended country, remove its most sensitive strategic asset, and be gone before the morning news cycle began. No invasion, no occupation, no body count that would dominate headlines for months, just the quiet, absolute demonstration of a capability that most people thought existed only in fiction. What that capability means for the future, and for everyone watching events like this unfold, that's the part of the story that lands closest to home. What it means for you. Let us strip away the military language and the geopolitical framing for a moment, and talk about the most direct line between what happened in the Persian Gulf that night and your actual daily life. The next time you stop for fuel, and the price is frustrating but manageable, not double what it was last month, not triple, that price stability has a cause. It doesn't happen because markets are calm or because oil companies are feeling generous. It happens because the waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply flows is open, and it's open because someone is making it stay open. The 82nd Airborne, the Marines of the 31st MEU, the Night Stalkers flying low over the desert, the E-2D operator 30,000 feet above the Gulf, tracking every launch signature in the theater. Those people doing that work on that night are the invisible mechanism behind the number you see on the fuel pump. That connection between a military operation on a rocky island in the Persian Gulf and the price of goods in your grocery store, your electricity rate, the cost of shipping that determines what you pay for virtually everything, is the one that most news coverage never quite draws clearly enough. Energy is not one sector of the economy. It is the substrate that every other sector sits on top of. When energy costs spike, everything costs more. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, heating, cooling, data centers, hospitals, everything. The Strait of Hormuz is the single geographic point where that substrate is most exposed. Protecting it is not abstract geopolitics. It is, in a very literal sense, protecting the cost of living for billions of people who will never know anything happened. But beyond the economics, there's a lesson embedded in how this operation unfolded that is genuinely worth understanding, because it tells you something important about where military power is going and what kind of conflicts the next generation will be watching. The steel ring failed. Not because it was poorly designed or underfunded or staffed by incompetent people. It failed because it was built around a model of warfare that no longer exists. The model where you identify the threat, position your defenses to face it, and wait for it to arrive. That model assumes you will have time. Time to see the threat, time to communicate it, time to respond. The American system that dismantled the steel ring was built around eliminating that time entirely. The sensor-to-shooter latency, the gap between detecting a threat and neutralizing it, was compressed to seconds. And when your defensive system requires minutes, those seconds are fatal. This isn't a lesson only about Iran. It's a lesson about every military force in the world that still relies on static positions, rigid command structures, and the assumption that a warning will come with enough lead time to respond. That assumption is no longer safe. The technology to eliminate that lead time exists and has been demonstrated.